welcome to Am Writing Fantasy and the 15-minute Fantasy Writer video series where you can learn great tips to get yourself writing fantasy and writing fantasy better on your lunch break and still find some time to write. I am author Autumn Burt, creator of Am Writing Fantasy and the 15-minute Fantasy Writer, and we're going to jump right into today an intro so you can know a little bit about me, why I'm doing this series, and what you can learn from it. So let's dive in. Okay, like I said, I am author Autumn Burt, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how I got started writing. And I will say, to start out with, I actually write my fiction books under my maiden name of Autumn Burt, actually Autumn M. Burt. And secret, the M stands for May. And no, I wasn't born in autumn or May, and my parents were actually in the army, so we don't know. My mom just says she liked it. But my married name is actually Autumn Raven. I mean, how cool is that? I wish I had actually taken that name before I started publishing, because Autumn Raven is a great, great fantasy author's name. But I didn't. I started under Autumn Burt, and not going to change that now. And I do use Autumn Raven for a few books, but we'll get into that. So, believe it or not, my first fantasy introduction was Dragon Impression on Pern, which is in 7th grade. I fell in love with a short story of Dragon Impression written by Anne McCaffrey way back in high school. And that really began my love of fantasy novels. I could not get enough. And of course, there were earlier, children's fairy tales, things like that. I still remember like the story All the Pretty Horses. They were obviously not real life, though I had read Nancy Drew. But I just absolutely was blown away by dragons, dragon impression, eggs hatching, and Pern and dragon riders. So that is where, to me, all my love of fantasy really began. And I actually dabbled in writing for years. I wrote a lot in high school. I actually won a writing contest in high school my senior year. I always forget about that. But I wrote on the side a lot of short stories and stuff. And I actually have an English degree and studio art degree, bachelor's of arts. Actually, that's one reason I don't think I ever took writing quite as seriously as maybe I should have, because everyone was impressed at how great of an artist I was. I love to draw, I love to watercolor and oil paints. And to me, that was what I was going to do. The English, the writing was kind of on the side. If anything, I was considering going on for a master's in illustration, thinking I would illustrate other people's books. But what actually ended up happening is I got an ecology and environmental science master's, which is, a totally different change. And I've worked for a long time, over 16 years in conservation and the conservation field. And I love the outdoors, as you can tell from the picture. Plus, come on, I thought it'd be soothing. This is probably your lunch break, right? So we're going to relax a little bit with the waterfall in the background. But around 2008, I decided to take writing a bit more seriously. I realized that it was more than a love. I loved it more than drawing. I loved it really more than anything. I had found my passion, and when I started taking it seriously, a lot of things started changing. And first of all, one of the first things I did, because 2008 was a long time since that undergraduate degree in my bachelor's, is I took 2 writing courses to get back into the swing of things after so many years as a professional conservationist, where I worked for the Natural Resource Conservation Service. I mean, that was a great job. We often joke that if you have to make money, that was a fantastic job. But it didn't bring that passion or joy into my life, even though I had a great sense of purpose. I mean, I was saving the environment after all. That's always awesome. And both courses taught me more about advanced writing, shouldn't be taught really, than anything practical. Because I will say, they had some interesting information. They had some useful handouts, but nearly the entire course was based on a student reading a sample of writing and getting feedback from other students. Then those other students actually didn't really know a thing about the rules of writing. I mean, we had no basis. Just a handout that we didn't even go over at the beginning of the course. And it was open to any genre, so they might not know anything about a genre, about a fan. I was one of two fantasy writers in both courses. And that was a challenge. I was working with a lot of people doing memoirs who might know where to put punctuation, but didn't know anything practical about how to write dialogue or what is common with adverb or adjective use in fantasy writing. It was really difficult. In fact, most of the feedback was just personal opinion, which helps in an artistic sense, like if you're looking at a painting, but not in any qualitative way to help a fledgling writer improve. So, really, what I learned was how I never really wanted to see a writing course taught and how not to give people tips or feedback. In fact, you really should know that, have that good grounding in what is good writing before you try to tell someone else what they should or shouldn't be doing. So, in this time, I will say I started writing a lot of books. 2008, like I said, was really the year when I started taking it seriously. And so I wrote a lot of fantasy books from 2008 to 2011. And when I say wrote, I mean rewrote, wrote, edited, wrote again, and was finally mostly happy with the book I was working on after the third version. And come on, the first book is the hardest, folks. If you haven't realized that, it's so true. I mean, I actually have another trilogy entitled Ancient Fragments that I rarely mention to people. I wrote it during this time, actually a little bit before this time. And of course, you know how this goes. It's my mother's favorite thing that I've written. And of course, I think it's horrible. It breaks about every writing rule out there. But it did show I had the dedication to write not just one book, but a whole series. And I had some skills in character creation and description. But I had so much more to learn. And that is really what it taught me and why I took some of those courses. But in 2011, my husband actually showed me an article about e-publishing on Amazon. And what was funny enough, the article he showed me was another federal worker, government worker like I was, who e-published and changed her life and changed her career. And it really had a huge impact for me because I realized I can do this too. I had been taking my book around, my fantasy book around for years, trying to find an agent, to find a publisher. And I was getting some great feedback. I had some good nibbles. I had some gorgeous rejection letters that I've kept about how much they actually liked it, but they were overbooked, didn't good fit. I mean, it could have been just lying through their teeth, but it made me feel like I had a shot at this. And that gave me the courage to say, hey, I can e-publish this and try it myself. And that all happened at the end of 2011. So at the beginning, that was December 2011. So in February 2012, I actually self-published Born of Water, which is my first epic fantasy book. And what's funny, and you could so get away with this back then, but not now, it had a horrible cover and a lackluster proofreading. I mean, I look back and I kind of cringe. I made so many newbie mistakes that I've come so far from. And I certainly learned by doing. So, I had to quickly learn the ropes and create a better cover and hired a much better editor. But I actually had people liking it even then, being very open-minded, because, I mean, I had 8,000, 10,000 downloads at one of my first free, when I had offered for free through KDP Select, because you could do that back then. It was really easy to be noticed and give away books because there might have only been 1 million to 2 million books on Amazon, unlike now when we're over 5 million books that are available. Those are ebooks. So, I mean, it's just crazy, the competition and how much that has changed since 2012, which isn't that long ago. And so I did write this first book, Born of Water, as an open-ended book, but I actually hadn't planned the second book. I hadn't even named the series. So, I mean, I realized when I published and really had a great time with it that I still had a lot to learn. So I had to figure out very quickly how to plot a series, tie everything together, because I love those tightly woven series where a clue in book 1 might kind of bubble up once or twice in book 2, but is so in the forefront in book 3. I love those types of books. And I had to learn really quickly how to write them so I could create this trilogy that I began kind of as like, oh, let's see if it works. Let's see if we find an agent. Oh, I published it. I have to find out what book 2 is going to be called. And that is where book 2 came from. It was called Rule of Fire. And I finally named the series The Rise of the Fifth Order Trilogy. And so Rule of Fire came in 2013. The third book and the final book of the trilogy came out in 2014, Spirit of Life. And that's where I realized, wow, it makes a huge difference. You kind of reached a little notch in your belt when you finish a whole trilogy. People love it, authors love it, other writers congratulate you, readers love it, so it's great. But I was still unhappy with sales. And so I signed with a vanity publisher in 2014 as well, right after Spirit of Life came out. And that lasted a whole 6 months before we divorced. um, I'm still with my husband, but I left my publisher pretty quick because what happened is I wasn't impressed with what he was doing either. He was just using KDP Select and rotating through a whole bunch of books, and I was now one of 60 some other authors, and I was used to being number one in my book. I was the publisher, I was the author, I had to do it all, but I came first. Now I was one of 64, taking someone else's little sliver of time he gave me. So I thought, you know what? I could do better than this. So I took a book marketing course and I took my books back and I got to work. And what ended up happening is that the next time I released some books, I had 4 books and all different series, near future dystopian, and I released all 4 books in 2015, back to back, with lots of linking between them. In fact, the first book is 11 short stories that are sequential, but are standalone. So I released each of those 2 weeks apart, trying to build an interest and get that kind of energy going. And then I began a new fantasy series in 2016 called Games of Fire. Book 1, Spark of Defiance, was released in March of 2016, and Gates of Fire and Earth was released in April of 2017. And I am currently working on A New Goddess, which is the last book, hoping it'll be out in the fall of 2017. Things are looking good for that. The goal right now is to finish the writing by September. So in total, I do have 12 books out now. That's, to me, amazing. I remember when I had just 1 under my Amazon profile. I have the whole Rise of the Fifth Order, which is epic fantasy, 3 books plus a novel companion. I have Friends of My Enemy, the dystopian series of 4 books. Now I have Games of Fire, 2 books for so far, maybe like 2.3 now. I also have Danger Peligros, which is a travel writing book written with my husband. And we also have together A Year and a Yurt, which is a non-fiction book, also written with my husband. And those 2, Danger Peligros and A Year and a Yurt, are actually under Autumn Raven. So that's how I kind of separate them out. All my fantasy is under Autumn Burt, but the non-fiction is under Autumn Raven. I've now been an indie author for 5 years. I have formats in ebook, paperback, and audio. Now I'm getting into some videos too. And I've hit number 1 on Amazon numerous times. And that's after once basically giving my books away to a publisher. And trust me, it all happened after I got out of that deal. I've taken writing courses, marketing courses, I've used trial and error, usually on the error side, and read the blogs, and I just kept writing and learning and writing. And I realized somehow that I've gone from a newbie to one of the experienced writers out there who have been going on for a while. So now I share what I've learned, and that is really what I'm hoping to do with this 15-minute fantasy writer video series. It started with my blog, Autumn Writing. That's where I really started giving away tips. But I just moved all those writing tips portion to the M Writing Fantasy blog, and that is literally mwritingfantasy.com. So my writing and my books pages are staying at Autumn Writing because that's my home base for my stories and the worlds of my stories. But now I've launched this YouTube channel to reach even more writers. And I launched a fantasy writing course, actually, the Ultimate Fantasy Writer's Guide, this spring in April 2017. And of course, on Am Writing Fantasy, I offer some booklets, coaching, content editing, and custom covers. But it's what I find interesting is, I've written all but the last 2 books while working a full-time day job. Plus, I have hobbies, that spouse I mentioned, family. We even built a house. Literally, we built the house, out there with hammer and nails and cutting logs together. So I know time is precious, especially writing time. Finding enough among everything to do this passion is really hard. But questions, inspiration, and tips are so important to make sure you're doing this right. You don't want to spend lots of time. You don't want to spend 3 years trying to perfect your first book, when a little bit of help, a few lessons can really keep you going. So that's why this is here. Welcome to the 15-Minute Fantasy Writer series. This is writing help that you can fit into your lunch break and still sneak in some writing time. So hopefully I'll see you here. Step back and see some more videos. They're coming up, and we'll have some great ideas and info, and see some of the tips below for ways to find out how you can be featured and have your books featured on 15-Minute Fantasy Writer on the open mic section.